Hi, fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to Myth and Magic, a fantasy writer's kit bag. I'm fantasy writer Neil Mack, the author of Moondog and the Reed Leopard, and I want to share my love of folklore, local history and nature mythology with writers and creatives like you on my regular podcasts. It's designed with fellow indie publishers and writers in mind, but all fans of fantasy fiction are very welcome to join in. In my fantasy writer's kit bag, writers, artists and creatives will find lots of ideas and discussion about things such as potions, dark arts, fabulous creatures, folktale studies, nature lore, and the interesting history behind the myth and magic that underpins our understanding of the fictional universe. Hello, Myth and Magic fans, and welcome to Myth and Magic episode 42. I'm going to cover three subjects this week, one of which might have been on your mind, and the other two which you possibly have never heard of, but we're going to cover them anyway because they are very important for your fantasy. But the first one, which you possibly have heard about, is bardo, B-A-R-D-O. And you might have asked yourself, what is a bardo? Now, we've talked about liminality in the past and about liminoid experiences. So, because of that, we do need to talk about the state of bardo. And it's the phase of intermediate existence that occurs between two lives on Earth. So that's why I'm pausing for a moment. Two lives on Earth is something that we need to wrap our brains around. And the concept originates in Tibetan Buddhism. In short, it's an intermediate existence that inserts itself between the existence that we call life, or the existence that we call birth, and the existence that we call death. In Tibetan Buddhist tradition, after a death and before a next birth, when a person's consciousness is not connected with any physical body, the individual will experience a variety of phenomena that can be quite useful, or even in some cases perhaps quite terrifying, but ought to be used to connect more spiritually with the universe. So Buddhist adherents therefore tend to prepare for the bardo, for this intermediate existence that exerts itself between the existence of death and existence of birth. They tend to prepare for bardo by repeating exercises and meditating on ideas that will help them make the most of that period, because it's a very important period. Metaphorically, bardo also describes those periods in our worldly existence where common life becomes suspended. So, for example, during a long illness or during a period of retreat from the community. And at these times, it's thought that the period of bardo aids spiritual progress because, of course, there are less external constraints and there are less external interruptions. So most of us will, at some period in our life, experience the metaphorical bardo, the period of suspension of ordinary time. And some people, for example, disciples and priestly people, monks and nuns, but also other people have done it, world leaders, they tend to actually take time out for a period of bardo. Now you might ask yourself, how does this compare with liminality? Do you remember when we discussed liminality before, we said it was a period of strangeness, of weirdness, because you were moving from one part of your life to another. It was part of the rite of passage, for example. But this is something which is taken on seriously, and it's taken on mindfully. A bardo is taken on as part of spiritual progress of a person. Of course, if you were suffering a very long illness, For example, you were in a coma for a while, that would also be a period of bardo that you had no control of. So although I just mentioned that there are disciples and priests who purposely take bardo, other people, of course, have bardo forced upon them. How does it compare and contrast with the Catholic idea of limbo? Well, limbo is from the Latin word limbus, which means on the edge or on the boundary. It's a bit more of a complicated notion. It's about a temporary state of being for all those who have, despite their sins on earth, died in the friendship of God, but for some reason cannot enter heaven. And normally the reason is because they hadn't sought the redemption of the saving grace of Jesus Christ, who makes it possible. So the concept of limbo reaffirms to Christian Catholic believers that admittance to heaven is only possible through the intervention of the Christ. That means, of course, that he had to go through limbo himself before his admission to heaven. Many other denominations have the same kind of neutral state before any enlightenment or before any judgment or reward. And in the DC comics, there is the term limbo is used. It's used to describe the dimension that's inhabited by old characters who might have been removed from the universe, or they might have been abandoned or forgotten by the normal writers. So in 2017's experimental novel by the American writer George Saunders, Lincoln in the Bardo, which might have piqued your interest in this, deals with the President Abraham Lincoln's grief and his period of bardo. It was a period of grief and great loss for him after the death of his treasured son, who was named Willie Wallace Lincoln. And in the Man Booker Prize winning novel, Saunders studies the idea of the bardo, and he examines an intermediate space between life and rebirth that has just occurred, and it occurred during one evening. So that's the bardo. What is a locus amaneus? So now I'm going to quickly go through what a locus amaneus is. The locus is Locus and amaneus is Amoenus. From the Latin, that means pleasant place. A locus amaneus is an idealised place of safety and comfort. A typical locus amaneus will have three basic elements. It will have trees, it will have grass, and it will have water. So it's a garden, a pretty garden. The Garden of Eden is a typical example. And often a remote garden will serve as an ideal locus amaneus in a novel or a story. This literary device probably goes back to at least 50 BC, and in works that later became known as pastoral, it became quite popular in the Romantic periods, and Victorians really liked it. They're called pastoral because they depict a pasture life that is highly unrealistic, and it's often very picturesquely romanticised version of what it actually is like to work in the country. If you've ever spent a weekend or even a week in the country, you'll see that it's not particularly perfect. There's lots of hard work, there's lots of grime, there's lots of mud, there's lots of smells. But a pastoral view of that is it's also perfect. Pastoral art, especially in literature, was especially important for early Roman and early Greek writers, but also for poets and fine artists. And they liked using the idea of a pastoral life because it contrasts the very stark differences that they saw between busy urban lifestyles in bustling cities and peaceful rural lifestyles, especially when they were making political arguments. They liked to demonstrate those contrasts. Some of Shakespeare's plays contained pastoral elements, but also the epic blank verse poem Paradise Lost by English poet John Milton 1608 to 1674, is thought to be the greatest pastoral epic ever written. You will note that the idea of a locus amaneus is used from time to time in fantasy fiction. And I think one good example of that is Bilbo's visit and then his later return to the haven of Rivendell. And Rivendell, when you remember how it's described, it is the perfect locus amaneus. It's used as a device when an author wants to stop everything going on to draw a breath. It's especially important if it's a hectic adventure, like the one that Bilbo Baggins and his quest in The Hobbit, or Frodo's hectic adventure in the Rings trilogy. It's a time for a hero to allow wounds to heal, not necessarily physical wounds, there might be mental wounds. And it's time also allows time for the hero to meditate on the challenges of the quest, the challenges to come and the challenges that have been dealt with. So it's a very important part of your story. It shouldn't be overlong, it shouldn't be necessarily very elaborate, but it should be there. And the concept is also used in other forms of literature to mark the contrast between chaotic and feverish labours, like, for example, the bread and butter existence that feels a normal life of belligerence and brawling, and it compares it with the longed-for serenity and the longed-for harmony that will come in the better life that is expected, or the better life that is trying to be earned. So in this respect, the locus amaneus is worth fighting for. And it could be a time rather than a place. So although I've so far described it as a place with grass and water, it might just be a time in a person's life. And that's why so many people midway through their lives are working towards their retirement. And their ideal picture of retirement is often a simple garden. After the Second World War, or after many of the wars, but I know for a fact that after the Second World Wars, people longed for a period of remembrance and reconciliation. It was a time rather than a place, the locus amaneus, that they were fighting for. But if you wanted to demonstrate a period of remembrance and reconciliation, how would you do that? How would you actually portray that artistically? You'd probably portray it as a garden of remembrance. And that's why after the First World War and the Second World War, so many gardens of remembrance were set up by local authorities. Now, if you use a locus amaneus in your fantasy, make it disproportionately uncorrupted and almost fully idealised. So a reader knows, the reader has a gut feeling that this is just a stopover place. It's a place where everyday rules of the fight and disorder of the rest of your novel are temporarily suspended. They should get a feeling right off that normal service will soon be resumed, but this is a stop-off place. In this way, your locus amaneus will serve as a basis for your heroes and the reader's basic desires, and it will demonstrate what's at stake if your hero fails to complete the quest. So that's another important reason why you need to stick a locus amaneus scene into your story. A well-written locus amaneus will also provide a glimpse into the best of possible outcomes and will serve as an effective counterbalance to all the hate and all the anguish and all the woe and all the challenges that you've described in the rest of the book. Good luck with creating your locus amaneus. If you have any trouble with it, tweet me, let me know how you get on, and good luck with your fantasy. What is a paracosm? A paracosm, P-A-R-A-C-O-S-M, is a very detailed and almost real imaginary world. You may well have been making paracosms all your life. Psychologists believe that most paracosms originate in a person's childhood. And famous authors, including the Brontes and Tolkien, C.S. Lewis and Terry Pratchett, seem to have encountered and then presented to the world their paracosmic universes to their audience. It's possible that paracosm play indicates a higher than average intelligence and an above average creativity, because children who indulge in these fantasies seem to have a very bright and very broad imagination. And in fact, you could even describe them as world players. Commonly, a world player will create their own geography and their own history and their own language even for their virtual world. And when it's complete, and normally only when it's complete, they may insert a real world or an imaginary character into it. They kind of insert their imaginary character into their imaginary world, almost like a research worker, as if this research worker has been asked to check it out. And then the creator of the paracosm will probably have a very complex and very deeply felt relationship with their subjective and make-believe universe. And the fabulized creation often stays with them. Perhaps it's honed down and developed, but it stays with them through their life and into adulthood. So, for example, Tolkien had been inventing languages since he was a teen, and those languages came out in Lord of the Rings. The Bronte family, all of them together, created fantasy kingdoms, including the fantasy kingdom of Gondal, and these helped later with their fictional worlds. Steph Swainston's Four Lands, which is all one word, Fourlandes, is based on her childhood paracosm, and Terry Pratchett's Disc World is thought to be based on very detailed paracosms that he had as a kid. C.S. Lewis and his brother Warren created a paracosm named Boxen, Boxen, and this later influenced the creation of Narnia. Now, creating paracosms is thought to be indicative of a fantasy-prone personality, F.P.P for short, which is a disposition to, or a lifelong love of fantasy. And it's why, as a fantasy author, you will want to create your very own intricate world for a readership. And it's also why they expect and they desire intricacy and complexness, because they also may be fantasy-prone people. Now, I'm not saying for a moment that you are paracosmic, but it's possible that it's a spectrum, and you may well be somewhere on that paracosmic spectrum. And it will be a lot easier to fabricate a sophisticated and abstract yet very detailed world if you are somewhere on that paracosmic spectrum and you've been creating worlds in your imagination since childhood. Now, if you, like me, had parents who commended your fantasy play, so for example, my parents welcomed us daydreaming, they certainly encouraged us to read fairy tales, they encouraged us to dance innovatively, and they certainly gave us a lot of time and encouragement in creating conceptual art. They also encouraged us, by the way, to believe in fairies and in magic. And they took us to church, so we also had the religion, I wouldn't say rammed down our throats, but it was certainly very, very in the forefront of things that we did. And incidentally, I don't want to go carp on about this, but incidentally, that fantasizing might also have provided me and my sisters with some kind of coping and escape mechanisms. But anyway, if you, like me, had parents who commended your fantasy play, then it's highly likely that you probably have developed a fantasy-prone personality, or you'd be on the F.P.P spectrum. Writing fantasy will help you, not only because you'll be able to write convincingly and compellingly about your paracosmic worlds, but also because your writing will become for you a purgative outlet. Other indicators of a fantasy-prone personality or being on the spectrum of F.P.P that might manifest themselves in your own life and certainly may manifest themselves in your reader's life, could include the following. 1. Fantasizing about things in general. Number 2. Having imaginary friends. Number 3. Possessing a fantasy identity. Number 4. Experiencing imagined sensations as if they were real. Number 5. Experiencing vivid sensory perception. And number 6. Experiencing sexual satisfaction without any physical stimulation. So that's, anyway, what a paracosm is, and a little bit there about fantasy-prone personalities. Good luck with your work. Let me know how you get on.